Hello and welcome to TelecomTV. I'm Martyn Warwick and we are here at the OpenStack Summit in Barcelona in Spain, and I'm with Neela Jacques, who is Executive Director of the OpenDaylight project. Neela, great to see you again. Let's kick off by, I want to ask you this. In the 4 years since NFV and open source and cloudification really came to the top of the agenda around the world, we have seen more and more and more open source projects of various sorts, or at least initiatives of the word open preceding something else. There are now, getting on for a dozen of them at least? Are we in a position, do you think, where there are getting to be too many?
On one hand, I would say it's a very good thing, right? I'd say no in the sense that, gosh, I'm so glad you're no longer asking me the question of, this open source stuff. Is it actually going to work? Are people going to be willing to pay for it? Are people going to invest and collaborate with each other? So on one hand, I think what you're seeing is open source is winning. Open source has won in a lot of cases. End users are asking for open source more and more. And the result is more often the developers who say, hey, I don't want to just do this on my own island. I want to do this collaboratively with others, are getting the okay from their companies. So in that sense, it's really good. But there is a downside, and the downside is complexity. The downside is potentially duplication of effort. We've got some cases in which there's one team that has the budget for open source, and they're finding themselves having to try and split their budget and their team's time across many. So I really do think it has both of those effects at once.
So given what you've just said and given what I've said, do you think it's time every industry, and particularly this industry, goes through spasms of collaboration and spasms of realignment and so on? Do you think it's time for that to happen again, or do you think it will happen as a matter of natural process?
I think we are moving into a time of some shifting, a couple different shifts. One of them is this one that you're talking about, which is, I think to start innovation, when you want to brainstorm, one of the first things you're taught is there's no judging during brainstorm. You don't say it's a stupid idea, you put every idea on the board, and then you go in and then you start eliminating them after a while and you pick the good ones. In the same way, I think to be able to get the kind of innovation that you see around here, we have had to allow everybody to come in with their idea and to go chase it. I think eventually, though, a little bit like the famous t-shirt problem. If you never throw out a t-shirt, every time you buy a new t-shirt, eventually you don't have room for all of your t-shirts anymore. And so we do need to go through a process of saying, how do we actually bring things together? How do we create greater collaboration? That's true within projects. We have sub-projects within OpenDaylight and OpenStack. How do you get greater collaboration across these sub-projects? How do you get consolidation across these sub-projects? How do you get collaboration across Uber projects? Maybe we'll see some Uber projects actually coming together under either one umbrella or actually taking the best of both. I think that over the next 3 years, we're actually going to see some degree of consolidation, which is healthy, which then leaves the space for the next generation of innovation.
The trick then, Neela, will be to do that without stifling innovation. How do you go about doing it?
Well, I think this is one where there is no easy answer. It's a little bit like, how do I build a successful startup? Well, I hire great people, have a good vision, get good technology, and then just execute. In the same way, there's a lot of roll up your sleeves. What I found is you do the following things. You find two people that in some way you think maybe should collaborate more or come together on something. You ask each of them, you get them in a room together, and you ask each of them to articulate what are their objectives? What do they think the solution will sound like? Then the second piece that I do is that I work to help people to see if you're able to get your view, to be the consensus view. How would that change the world? How would that change your world? You'd get more resources, you'd get more end user traction. Okay, so clearly everybody will agree. If we can get everybody else to jump on their bandwagon, they'll be really, really happy. Then the next cognitive step is to say, well, it's unlikely that everyone's vision is going to come to pass. And therefore, in the same way as you would like everyone to come to yours, that other guy would like you to come to his. I'm not saying you should, but let's come in a room together and let's talk about, given neither of you is likely to get exactly what you want and we've agreed it makes more sense together, let's see if we can get the best of both. And we've recently seen that within OpenDaylight. We had a project called NetVert, OVSDB NetVert, around network virtualization. We had a second project called SFC, Service Function Chaining. And it really made a lot of sense to get them together, but they had different leaders, different teams with different ideas. And so we were able to get them in a room and get them talking and talked through their issues, they compromised, and they came together, and they're now one project. And so this is really what people like me do all day. We spend a lot of time trying to identify who are the right people, when is the right time, what's the right forum, and then it's execution. It's just like getting a deal done in business development. We get really excited when we can take two things that were separate and now actually get them close together.
Actually, in the environment when you're doing the persuasion, when you've got the parties together, do sparks fly, or is it generally slowly a matter of the consensus emerging, a bit like it does in some parts of British politics?
You know, it's kind of funny you say that. There's a guy I respect a lot, Jim Zemlin, who has this famous line that he likes to say, which is, when you take the money out of something, something has to come in and replace it. You take the fat out of yogurt, they have to put more sugar in it. So you take the money out of software, do you know what comes in to replace it? Ego. Seriously. So absolutely, people feel they love their babies. They're their babies. They worked late nights to get to their babies. They have strong opinions because they're developers. Their EQ sometimes is well developed, sometimes not so well developed. So absolutely, and what we try to do is find, again, the right time, the right venue, keep it non-personal. You give people timeouts. It's sometimes a little bit like parenting in the best sense of the term.
Must be an interesting process. Let's move on now to OpenDaylight itself. We've seen a rise now of end users deploying in production and at scale with open source materials, open source coding, etc. Entire projects. Where does OpenDaylight sit in this? How do you see things developing right now? And where are we? End of October 2016.
So we are at about the 3.5-year mark, as you correctly identify, and you're right, we've seen sort of this huge shift, and this was the second big shift I was talking about, which is when we began, they were only developers, and most of them worked for vendors, because we didn't solve any problems, we didn't have any solutions. Sure. Today, now 3.5 years in, we have a different dynamic. We have end users, as you said, who have picked it up. They gave us feedback. We had, for example, Chris Rice at AT&T, who runs all of their infrastructure for their business, get on stage and talk about saying, open source isn't just a science project. We're putting open source at the core of our business. Specifically, we have built an infrastructure development and deployment platform. It's called eComp. We plan to open source it. At the heart of eComp is OpenDaylight. And it's been in production for 2 years. We're thrilled with eComp, we're thrilled with OpenDaylight, and we're telling all of our vendors, if you want to work with us, you have to work with this core platform. And that's why we're building an open source project based on it with the Linux Foundation. We had Tencent, so in China, right, very different kind of business, get up and say, we started with data center interconnects. Now we've got a cloud where we're extending the network out to our customers. We've got 7 other use cases. Comcast got up and said, we can now put in a banner inside when you're surfing the internet, like we can on your TV, that says, hey, you haven't paid your bill. In the past, we used to cut it off after a couple days, but now we're going to say, hey, if you just, as long as you go to call Comcast, pay your bill, and you won't have any interruptions. That's being run by OpenDaylight. They're having an area where if I have Comcast Digital Voice and I hang up, right now that bandwidth stays dedicated to my phone line. Now they can make it dynamic and give that bandwidth back to me. Really intelligent thing. They're doing that with OpenDaylight. So we're seeing the end users, deploying in a completely different way, in a much bigger way in production than they ever were before. Microsoft IT talked about how they're going to destroy the idea of the corporate network and go internet first. The second thing is they're getting engaged more deeply. They're putting developers. Half of all of our new projects in the last release didn't come from vendor organizations. They came from end user organizations. They're proposing them, they're bringing developers to the table, and they're driving the projects. So this is a huge difference. Now really the big question that I have on the end users is, they've shown that they're willing to go out and use OpenStack. They've shown that they've been willing to use OpenDaylight. The question is, are they willing to pay for it? Either by paying significant amounts to the vendors for the vendors to continue to invest in the projects, or are they willing to hire a big set of developers to work within the projects? Because this technology costs money. In OpenDaylight, I need to raise $100 to $150 million worth of resources every single year to advance the project. OpenStack is probably a couple times that or more. So this is, I think, the big question facing our industry is open source in many ways is winning. We're having that shift from vendor to user, but are people willing to pay for it?
What's your gut feeling on it? You're working at it day by day. You say you're raising the money every year. You're looking at the way things are developing. You see it becoming a reality. What's your gut feeling?
I think we have a huge tragedy of the commons. It's like pulling teeth to get people to invest on that common core, but I am seeing it. And so I'm generally an optimist. I am hopeful. I think a lot of people are working really hard for that, but I think yes. And just the question is, how quickly will we see that happen?
Very interesting stuff. Next time we meet, I'll ask you again. Until then, Neela Jacques, thanks again.
Always a pleasure.